webinar. The topic is QA role in Agile teams. We've been practicing Agile for a long time with a number of our clients, and one of the topics that has often come up as a challenge for Agile adoption and practice in a smooth way is how does the role of a QA professional evolve or change when you are following Agile versus waterfall. So in today's webinar, we'll discuss this topic. We have done this discussion a number of times before, but this seems to still be a relevant topic, so we thought we'll revisit this again today. So we'll discuss the shift that happens in the role of QA in Agile teams, and then we'll talk about specific responsibilities of an Agile tester along the Agile development life cycle, and then of course hit some of the common do's and don'ts and how to avoid the don'ts in typical situation. In terms of logistics, we have roughly about 45 minutes or so for the prepared presentation, and then we'll leave still another 10 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. You are welcome to ask any questions as the content is being presented, and I'll just make sure any question that falls right through the flow, we'll pick it up along the way, and then the rest of the questions we'll take at the end. With that, let me introduce our speaker, Michael Hall. I'm delighted to have Mike present this webinar again with us. Mike is a practitioner and leader of Agile software development practices since 2000, and he's particularly good at covering these topics because not only is he a thought leader in Agile practices, but also actually involved day to day in managing teams and doing Agile development. So his perspective comes from a practitioner's viewpoint, which is all very valuable in these topics. With that, let me turn over. Actually, before I do that, also let me, one question only comes up, the presentation. So we're going to make the presentation available to you guys separately. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the presentation. With that, let me turn it over to Mike to take it away.
Okay, thank you, Hemant, once again for this opportunity. This is an encore presentation called QA Role in Agile Teams. Generally has a good attendance for it. I guess as a starting point, I'll mention that in Agile projects, there is a natural focus on quality. Developers are trying their best to get to the definition of done for their user stories and their sprints. They're using test-driven development, oftentimes pair programming, at least for the complex problems, continuous integration, and emergent design to help ensure that the code is of the best quality. And then the quality assurance folks, the QA folks, become even more important in this equation throughout the entire project lifecycle with their upfront involvement, their participation on writing user stories, the cross-checking of the acceptance criteria, their participation in providing estimates, and then most importantly, the development of automation scripts. So I've always said that the QA person's role in life from a work perspective is very much elevated in an Agile world. Okay, with that, I'm going to quickly cover the agenda here, and let's see. Okay, there we go. All right, today's webinar discussion, I'm going to do a brief introduction of Agile methods and quality, and then the majority of the time will be spent in the next two topics. I'll do a comparison of QA in traditional versus Agile, and then we'll talk about the Agile QA person's responsibilities. I'll conclude with some common mistakes and a brief conclusion. So, Agile methods and quality. Well, the Agile Manifesto is made up of 12 principles such as early and continuous delivery. Another one is welcoming changing requirements. And there's a ninth principle within the Agile Manifesto that deals with technical excellence. And it says continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. And so the point is that technical excellence goes hand in hand with a focus on quality. And honestly, based on my experience, the Agile projects emphasize quality much more than traditional. You know, when Agile first came out or started first being formalized in the late 1990s, it got a little bit of a bum rap. People thought it was just an ad hoc approach, an excuse to not write documents, and you know, it had all of those negative connotations about, we're not too concerned about quality. But as it became formalized and matured, nothing could be further from the truth. It's a much more disciplined quality focus than anything that I've ever used, which includes traditional Spiral, RUP, and Agile. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Agile Manifesto, where it says we value the things on the left over the things on the right. For example, we value working software over comprehensive documentation. Now, the things on the right are not ignored. They're just secondary to the main things on the left. And when a decision needs to be made, we make decisions more in the left column than we do in the right column. So the question becomes, how do we apply these Agile values and principles to QA and testing? And hopefully the next few sections will answer that question for you. So let's get into applying Agile to QA. Quick comparison. In the traditional world, the quality assurance team is a separate team. The developer might say to a QA person, well, you're not good enough to be a software developer, that's why you're a QA tester. And the QA tester would rightfully respond to that by saying something like, well, you write buggy software, and that's and you could never you could never be a QA person because we don't allow buggy software. Well, these you know, types of statements are silly and petty, and they actually reinforce that artificial wall between the organizations of the development team and the QA team. In Agile, the QA testers are an integral part of the development team. Now let me say that again. In Agile, the QA testers are part of the development team. Now you might say, well, what does a QA person develop? Well, I would answer that by saying the QA person in an Agile project helps develop the acceptance criteria for the user stories. The QA person also develops test plans. And as I stated before, they also develop automation using scripting languages. So think of QA folks as a developer with a knack of ensuring the highest level of quality. And so in doing so, a developer might, or a QA person might make a statement such as, I'm part of the development team with specialized expertise in delivering quality. I would say as software developers, it's good for us to have people on our team that have a lot of experience and expertise in delivering quality. The QA person might also ask, well, what can I do to help today? Also, how can I help us ship a defect-free product? What can I do to make it easier to achieve our definition of done? And then here's another really good one. What pieces can I go ahead and automate based on what I know right now? So those are some of the questions that an Agile QA person might ask in support of helping the team achieve their committed milestone. Also in traditional, you know, we do this verification testing at the end. Certainly not advisable because historically that can cause slips in the project schedule. When this big bang integration is done at the end, often that can cause a schedule slip, primarily because of a lack of collaboration between the teams that are integrating their software systems. Now I know that that's a generalized statement. It is, however, based on my experience, and I've lived through a few, I've lived through many of these, and so certainly that was my experience. Now, in Agile, Agile says, okay, test continuously as early as possible. So if you're an extreme programming disciple, you know that Kent Beck would say, is software release testing a good thing? And we would all answer yes. Then he would say, okay, let's figure out a way to do that continuously all the time, or as he would say, in an extreme manner. So in Agile, each iteration is tested against customer requirements and the quality standards. For example, if you have a 2-week iteration cycle or even a 4-week iteration cycle, your first round of customer feedback or customer proxy feedback would be within that 2 to 4 weeks compared to the 6 to 9 months that a traditional life cycle might require. And we all know that earlier feedback is better. Well, also traditional has an over-reliance on documents. You know, we've all heard the statement, if it's not written down, it does not exist. I used to state that regularly. And that's traditional thinking that we need a comprehensive document for historical purposes. It's also flawed thinking because the document is typically out of date the day after it's written. And honestly, no one has time to constantly keep it up to date, much less read it. So in an Agile world, we admit that documents are good, but we think about documents, what is the minimal amount of documents that we truly need? And they're secondary to tacit knowledge. Tacit awareness and knowledge of the requirements and the design is what we value over the writing of the documents. And this leads to shared understanding. It's much easier to focus and rally a team around the project vision. So I was working with a team recently and actually came into a good reason for a document, and we went off and documented it. Just real briefly, we had developed some baseline code for a single hospital. Our particular client, Tenet Healthcare, owns 50 different hospitals. So we developed a single code base for each of those 50 hospitals, but they had requirements. Each hospital wants their own branded mobile application. So we developed a single code base, and then we would rebrand it by swapping out the URLs and the logos and the color themes for each of the other 49 hospitals. Well, we felt like it would be good to document the reskin procedure describing how to modify the baseline app for another hospital. That way we could hand this activity off to a new hire or someone of a lesser salary or hourly rate, and would allow for keeping a record of that procedure. So that's a good example of a minimal documentation approach. Traditional, you know, how design is done in a traditional world and how the development is done. Basically, each sub-team of area experts builds their part. Then somewhere near the end, usually a month before the launch date, a massive integration occurs. And this has typically been a very difficult proposition, sometimes a disaster. And as I said before, generally, you know, there's not a high level of collaboration on the interface expectations. The assumptions are made, and the lack of shared understanding can lead to some difficulties during this big bang integration approach. Now, in Agile, it's quite different. It takes that pain of the big integration approach and spreads it out throughout the entire project. For example, you'll see the vertical slices I'm showing here, which represent end-to-end functional slices. These are typically user stories, or you can think of them as features. In Scrum, it's called sashimi. And this includes full end-to-end functional slices from the user interface to the business logic, to the middleware, to the database, and all the way back up the chain. And your red slices might be iteration 1, and your green slices shown now might be iteration 2, and then maybe your blue slices or iteration 3. And you can see how the different architectural layers are built out over time using this vertical slice or sashimi type approach. Now what this means to the QA and developers is that the integration of these layers, if you will, occurs as you go. This allows us to find issues earlier, resolve them, and in effect totally avoids the big bang integration at the very end. Also a comparison from a traditional perspective to Agile. In traditional you have these artifact handoffs. In Lean the word handoff is equivalent to waste, as it generally means someone is waiting for you to complete something before they can do that part of their job. And then we often have this wall of uncertainty is what I call it, where development, kind of throws over the wall this big design spec or source code to the test team and then says, please read my 400-page document and understand it as well as I do. And oh, by the way, ignore the fact that it's a little bit out of date. And oh, by the way, ignore the fact that we've squeezed you down from 6 weeks of final testing to 3 or 4 weeks. In Agile, we have a much more holistic development approach where QA and developers work on user stories, defining acceptance and automating acceptance test cases. We do the functional slice testing, even unofficial testing, development of wikis and communication and collaboration across that, daily synchronization where the QA person definitely participates, and then face-to-face conversations about bugs instead of some sterile tool like Bugzilla or Clear DDTS or some other way of communicating bugs. So developers with design coding and QA expertise participate holistically together at the same time. Another big difference in traditional versus Agile is in traditional, it's all about conformance to the plan. We measure success as adherence to the plan. And then as development and testing veers off of the plan, we take corrective measures to bring it back to conformance to the plan. In Agile, it's a little bit different. As development and testing veers off, we go back and ask, is it righteous to change the plan? And if so, we change the plan as we go. And so that's in support of welcoming change, verifying relevant goals, and then ending up with a system that's relevant for that point in time versus a system that was relevant 6 or 9 months ago. And we have this great quote by Napoleon Bonaparte who says, a battle plan lasts until contact with the enemy. And very much in software development, we don't necessarily have enemies, but it's good to do a good amount of planning up front, at least at a high level. But then as soon as we start coding, we learn from that, and we adapt our plan to that, and we improvise, and we overcome very much in the same way that Napoleon's soldiers would do once they had contact with their enemy. Another comparison is that in traditional, there's a lot of manual testing. If you have time at the end, you might want to automate your regression suite. Generally, it's pretty painful, and the automation is only after the product has been out into the market for some time. In Agile, it actually begins by thinking up ways to automate as you go. Even the developers, from a unit testing perspective, they'll use some XUnit tools or try their best to get some test first or test-driven development into their life cycle. And then obviously QA comes in and does the functional sashimi testing, the integration testing as you go, the release testing, and then maybe a regression of the previous delivered sashimi slices. This makes it very easy to verify that existing functionality is not harmed by a bug fix or a new feature. And as you can see, this is where automation comes in, and that becomes very important. Traditional from a hiring perspective. Well, we want to hire testers that are good at writing test plans and executing those. So writing skills become very important. The ability to read a test case and execute it. So a very disciplined, logical thinker. And we're not too concerned that maybe they don't have well-honed software development or coding skills. In Agile, it's definitely different. It's not so much about writing skills or executing written instruction. It is definitely still a disciplined, logical thinker type person. But the foremost thing on our mind is that person's ability to code and create automation through scripts, fitness, wattage, or whatever. So the ability to program scripts is much more prominent in an Agile world. Also from a hiring perspective, in traditional we're looking for testers that can take their assignment and run with it and then report back their progress. And oftentimes they will work independently with minimal collaboration required. In Agile it's totally different. Testers have a knack, we're looking for testers that have a knack for collaboration and team-based accountability. So this is where people skills become much more important than they might have been in the traditional world. So we're looking for people that encourage others. We're looking for people that are approachable, that resonate a positive attitude, that can mentor others, and a skill that is team focused and not so much ego focused. Okay, so that's at least a broad brush summary of some of the differences between traditional and Agile from a QA perspective. Now let's jump into the Agile QA responsibilities. One of the major complaints of a traditional QA person is that for whatever reason they're generally not involved in the upfront planning. Well, the good news is that in Agile, Agile says the QA person is a critical team member and is involved in the upfront planning and is very active in doing that. So think about development of user stories. QA people are great at helping develop these user stories and thinking outside the box and coming up with additional user stories that nobody else thought of. A user story is not complete unless it has acceptance criteria on the back or within your tool. And this is where the QA person can really shine. Their knack for identifying scenarios or combinations that might cause issues can turn these acceptance criteria, from average into great. So, and then in doing these acceptance criteria up front like this is a form of test first. That's what Kent Beck used to call his test-driven development approach inside extreme programming. He called it test first. So injecting this level of test first from a quality perspective, you definitely want your QA folks involved in the writing of the user stories. Secondly, the QA person offers up product backlog items along with estimates to the product owner. In Scrum, the product owner manages the product backlog and uses it to track and prioritize all of the work items. And there should be specific QA activities in here. Looking at the example, there's a few: established test automation harness, and regression test the legacy software components. The QA person is vocal about offering these up and vocal about driving their estimate. And also, the QA person is very vocal in making statements about the level of test activities within each and every user story. So if the test effort is large, the QA person in their planning poker or t-shirt sizing exercise, they need to convince the team that the estimate needs to be larger. Maybe it needs to be a 20 instead of a 13. If the QA person is convinced the testing effort and automation effort there is small, then help the team drive that estimate even lower. Sprint backlog. Scrum uses a sprint backlog also. It's basically a subset of the product backlog. You'll see the blue items here. Those are stories or major work activities taken from the product backlog. And then the breakdown underneath that is the task associated with each of those stories. So again, the QA person would be offering up tasks that contribute to the delivery of that user story and being very vocal about those and their estimate in terms of hours. And then from a sprint planning and release planning perspective, the QA person will help the team decide what to take on in an iteration and will help the product owner predict what can be in a release a few months down the road by participating in coming up with the estimates and then the general awareness of the team's velocity. QA person should be extremely vocal in helping the team come up with a solid definition of done. This is an Agile technique that ensures a certain level of quality within each delivery to the customer, and prior to each project, the development team, which does include QA folks, should decide on their definition of done for the user story level. They should also decide on the definition of done for the iteration or sprint, and then the definition of done for a release. And the quality attributes that constitute each of those three levels should be documented and made well known to within the team and the stakeholders and the customer. So here's some examples. Maybe you want to start with all new and modified code is reviewed by at least one other person. All code adheres to our coding standards or guidelines. Another one might be all code checked into the subversion product branch. Another one might be zero known bugs. Quick side story here. I recently had a discussion with a client who basically said that all software has bugs. And while I guess in general I agreed with him, I did make a few statements about, well, my advice is to always set your goals high, which there's no higher goal than zero known bugs, and drive your internal procedures around creating shippable product code that has zero known bugs. Now you might say, well, can we water that down to zero critical bugs? Sure, you can use that as a starting point, but I've always had really good success with setting the bar very high and saying that at least internally we create software that has zero known bugs. Now once the software is out in the field in your clients' and customers' hands, obviously they're going to run some scenarios that you were unable to simulate adequately, or they'll just find bugs that the development team did not find. That's okay. Definitely keep account of those. But I've always said that you should start with a zero known bugs as kind of an internal measurement as part of your definition of done. And go from there and get as close as you can to it. We actually have a white paper which discusses this a little bit and how to migrate towards a very rigorous quality plan and definition of done over time by starting out slow, choose 2 or 3 of these on this list, and then every subsequent project add 1 or 2 from that list. QA has a responsibility of sashimi acceptance testing. Basically, it's your goal to do a final check of these user stories and verify that they are truly done and adhere to the definition of done. And then maybe it's your job to move the task card or the story card over from the end work column on your storyboard into the done column. And then each subsequent iteration, you continue to verify those. Now what you'll notice in an Agile approach is that every time a new sprint's worth of user stories come in, you have to go back and regress the previous sprint work in order to ensure that nothing in the current sprint has broken a previous sprint functionality. And that's where it becomes very difficult to do that manually. So that's where you need the test case automation to, in theory, press a button and verify that the previous test cases are regressed correctly and show a green status. Also, big that I've noticed in Agile teams is this concept of getting some unofficial code and providing the developer feedback later that same afternoon. So that can be very valuable and help the developer learn and take some corrective actions before it's even officially given to the QA person. So in Agile, there's a lot less formality and a lot less of official gives. You're just basically being given the code by the developers as quickly as they can give it to you, and then you're giving them feedback. So at some point you'll have to decide to write some bugs. Maybe that's later on in the 2 weeks. Now, you might be asking at this point, well, how in the world can all of this be done if your iterations are only 2 weeks long? And I'd like to give credit to this chart here by it was developed by edgehopper.com, so feel free to go there and look at this. But basically, QA starts the 2-week iteration by assisting in the sprint planning. And then, based on what they know, they'll start creating some automation and writing some test cases for that. And then during the 2 weeks, development, the software developers, basically the QA person is married to the software developer, tied at the hip, is what I like to say. But during the 2 weeks, multiple times, the developers are giving their code over to QA to do a quick assessment of it based on their automation capability. So the QA person tests and gives feedback as quickly as they can, because tick-tock, the meter's running to this 2 weeks. And then towards the end, the developers start concentrating on fixing any bugs that have been reported, and you want to start doing that several days towards the end of the sprint. And then a day or so before the end of the sprint, the QA person wraps up with retest and final acceptance. So that's how it all can be done within a 2-week cycle. Test case automation is also a prime responsibility of the QA person. QA must collaborate with the team members, the product owner, and the customer to anticipate what the result might look like, and then go ahead and lay in some automation structure for that, and then fill in the specifics as you learn more during those 2 weeks.
Mike, can we take a question on your previous page?
Sure.
So the previous page you have where the QA gets involved in the development cycle. So you have 2 days, Monday, Tuesday, where the coding is happening, and then at that point your QA is writing the test, and on Wednesday they start doing testing those. Now, what happens in situations where the coding is taking longer than 2 days, let's say the entire week or maybe even more? Is QA waiting?
Well, no, QA is not waiting. QA is doing what they can. But since they're participating in the daily synchronization stand-up meeting, then they're listening very, very hard to the software developers. They're having conversations throughout those 2, 3, or 4 days with the software developers, and they're doing whatever they can to anticipate what they're going to be given. Now, this is also a good comment to the software developers. With only a 2-week run, don't just give your QA folks your software by the middle of the second week. That's not going to work. As soon as you have some semblance of a functional slice developed, even if it's incomplete, go ahead and give that to your QA person and ask for their feedback. Now, in return, the QA person might say, okay, I'm going to give you some feedback. Maybe it's not so important for me to write up the bug, but I'm going to give you some feedback and let you know how that's going. And then based on that feedback, the QA person is able to work in more of their automation and be able to better anticipate what the, I guess, the final internal release is going to look like midweek of the second week.
Let me ask a follow-up to this question.
Yeah.
Does the QA, you showed the sashimi slices in the earlier slides here. So does QA have to wait till the entire story along the lines of a sashimi slice is done, or do they need to, or should and can they get involved earlier in that?
Yes, they can and should get involved earlier. For example, there may be an end-to-end functional slice that says, okay, for us to call this done, it must satisfy the following 5 acceptance criteria. Maybe the software developers have got it to a point where it already satisfies the first 1 or 2 criteria. Absolutely. Let your QA person run with that and confirm whether or not it satisfies those. And through talking about the remaining 3, the QA person can go ahead and lay in the groundwork for the automation of what's remaining there. So even when a user story is partially done, to some extent down the chain from top to bottom and back, the QA person can be developing automation. And that's what I mean by when I say the QA person is paired at the hip with the development team. And if for any reason your QA folks are not sitting with the developers, they need to be. So great questions, and keep those coming. Okay, let's continue. As I said, anticipation of the test case automation is crucial. And then, if the QA person has some automation already written, then go ahead and run that prior to integrating the software to it. That's a good, obviously the test cases will fail, or you would expect them to fail, but that's a good form of test first or test-driven development, which we all know at this point is a good software practice. Some popular tools for test case automation on the developer side, the unit testing suite, the open source for XUnit. You've heard of CPP unit, JUnit, things like that. Also, there's Unit Test++, JTest, UT MySQL, and et cetera. All of those are good popular tools for test-driven development. Now, for the QA person, there's several open source options such as Fitness and Selenium. Cruise control is a popular tool for doing continuous integration. There's Wattage, Wattin. I've actually used Wattage, and it's really good. You can ask your QA folks to learn the Wattage syntax, and it's a very small subset of the Java syntax, and QA folks can typically pick that up readily. Obviously, there's commercial tools like HP Mercury, WindRunner, LoadRunner, Silk Test, and things like that. So there are a bevy of tools out here to help you automate your test cases. QA person, if you have any reluctance to learn a programming language, you need to lose that reluctance, because this is the new QA person in the Agile team. They will be expected to know programming languages and scripting languages in order to create test case automation.
Mike, can you clarify one thing on that page of the unit testing? So you said some things along the way in the earlier part. So who's doing unit testing? Is QA person expected to do unit testing?
Oh, okay.
Unit testing being done by developer? Can you be clear about the roles?
Yeah, it's good to clarify that. Unit testing is done by the software developer. And as we all know, in Agile and also in traditional, quality starts with the software developer. However, I think in the traditional world, there was more excuses for developers to say, hey, quality is something that's tested in by the QA people. It doesn't necessarily start and end with me. In an Agile world, the developers all know just by how Agile is structured that quality begins and ends with the developers, and it has to be baked in. And the way it's baked in is adherence to definition of done, doing vertical slices a few at a time, and using these unit testing type tools. So, clarification, unit testing is by developers. The sashimi, which is the user story testing, the implied integration of that is also done somewhat at the unit testing level by developers, but primarily sashimi integration, release, and regression testing is done by the QA person. And this is the extra level of quality value that the QA person brings.
Okay. Let's take another question. So the question is, how can you automate, test, and use these tools if there's only one QA person? So I guess there's some kind of concern around is QA totally stretched doing all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's you might have to ask for another QA person, or maybe a hotshot college intern to augment and supplement your staff to get the right amount of coverage. Because if you're having to do manual testing, often you're probably so busy doing that there's just no time to develop the automation testing. Another way to approach it is when a new project starts. Consider this. Instead of spending your time developing manual test procedures and executing those, spend that time developing test case automation instead of what you were doing previously. So now, if you face a significant learning curve with the syntax or the script SDK or the scripting environment, then that may not be a viable option for you, but I would advise always try it, because if you don't ever try to replace what you're doing, you'll still be doing what you're doing 3 or 4 years from now, which is manual testing.
Let's take another related question, Mike, on this one then. And what's the depth to QA ratio? Meaning, given the types of things that a QA is to do, what's the right ratio to be shooting for?
Well, I find in Agile teams a good ratio is 1 QA developer to 3 or 4 software developers. So if you think about Scrum teams that are 7 plus or minus 2, you'll generally find 2 QA people on that team. Now, that might be more of a greenfield type build software from scratch ratio, and I guess I'll bounce it back to you, Hemant. You have a lot of experience in dealing with legacy systems and adding features to existing systems. What would you say in an Agile environment that ratio? Does it go up or does it go down?
So our experience, Mike, on this is, like you pointed out, if it is a greenfield development, you're building something from scratch, you don't have a code base to deal with just yet, and you don't have a set of installed base of customers to deal with just yet. In those cases, the 3:1 ratio is pretty good. You have, for every 3 developers, 1 QA is a good starting point, the rule of thumb for the ratio. But on the other side is when you actually have a large body of code that has already been built and been installed for a while, and you have large number of installed
a lot of customers.
Yeah. You have to make sure all customer-specific test cases and integrations are being tested, and you have multiple environments to test for each release and all that. When you get to that end of maturity of software, then you're probably closer to 1:1.
Wow.
For every developer, 1 QA.
Yeah.
And then you get.
I could see that. Yeah.
In fact, you can even go up from 1 developer to 2 QA over time if you don't automate.
Right.
So automation becomes imperative at those stages.
Yeah. So I think from a QA perspective, the number becomes more equitable as your system matures. Absolutely. And you get more consumer customers out there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, and it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, the strong focus on quality. Well, who better than the QA person to bring in that quality mindset? Absolutely. And not that software developers don't do that, they absolutely do, but having a person specialized in that level of expertise on your team becomes more and more valuable. And it goes back to what I said at the start of the seminar. If you're a QA person, you're really going to like Agile because your lot in life and the way people look at you is definitely in an elevated sense now, and you're involved up front, and you can basically call the shots. Also, let me continue here so we can wrap up here in about 5 minutes. The QA person's responsible for release testing, obviously, and since development is incremental, there generally is not a long work item for release testing at the very end, but it is normal to take a few days and re-verify all of the functional slices and that they're coexisting nicely together prior to an official release. Also, the QA person is responsible for regression testing, and you know, an Agile tenet is continuously integrating and constantly regressing the software, and ideally you want to do this through an automated build and test where each software change is quickly verified. Now, if continuous integration is not used, one technique I've seen with a few of my clients is to use a staggered approach to quickly regress the previous sprint's work. It's not ideal because, you know, at the end of each sprint you want potentially shippable code. So if you have not regressed it, then you're kind of violating that. If you have not regressed it within the sprint, then you're somewhat violating that, but it's a walk before you run type thing. If you have to start like this, then start like that, but then work as hard as you can to get that regression done within the confines of your time box sprint. Continuous feedback, QA needs to be providing continuous feedback. The QA person is much more collaborative in an Agile team, constantly giving feedback. As I said before, they attend the daily scrum and talk about their current status and progress. You know, and also I'll offer this. QA, you know you're doing right by the team if you're talking to the software developers about their bugs instead of entering them into a tool. So obviously, for the record, you need to go off and enter it into the tool, but make sure that the first time the software person hears about the bug is from you verbally face-to-face. And also remember, if the software is buggy, don't point fingers at the developer. It's your responsibility as a team member to help analyze why and suggest improvements to the Scrum Master and the team. In Agile, software developers are reminded daily that they are responsible for the quality of the code. You know, and is it maintainable? Is it robust? Is it easily enhanced? And that's a good thing. QA engineers provide this additional level of quality verification, supporting the definition of done and verifying all levels of the code output with a mindset of automate, automate, automate. Now, let's wrap up with at least 5 or 6 common mistakes that I've seen over the years with QA and their role in an Agile team. Well, the first one, the most obvious one, is that the sashimi tests are run in a subsequent sprint. And there's a lot of things wrong with that that definitely violates the Scrum potentially shippable product increment. So even if your customer does not take advantage of receiving a product increment at the end of each sprint, it's still a good idea to instill that mindset in the development team and to shoot for that because it's less work that you will have to do on the back end. Another common mistake is doing a mini waterfall handoff to QA within the sprint, and this violates the lean and Agile principles. Definitely think of QA as an integral member glued to the hip of the software developer, you know, even watching over their shoulder, anticipating what the code might look like, and preparing automation, and then kind of a seamless transition of that software code into the automation environment, as opposed to a miniature waterfall with handoffs. Another common mistake is manual testing of sashimi slices. Now, I have seen this work in 1-month iterations or 1-month sprints, but it was very costly and definitely inefficient. I have never seen this work well in a 2-week sprint. So the shorter the iteration, the more you will need automation, and you just won't have time to do manual testing. Another common mistake is QA not involved in user story development. I'm telling you folks, QA folks bring a level of talent to the table that I could never approximate in my wildest imagination. If you want righteous user stories, get QA involved up front in the definition of those. Another common mistake, QA not involved in the release and sprint planning. You know, we need QA's opinion about the size of the estimates. What do you think we can do within this sprint? What do you think can be done in a release? So let's get their opinion up front. It's very valuable feedback. Another common mistake is that QA is not physically located with the project team. Do something crazy, break down those walls, integrate your QA people within your software developers and set them you know, in alternating fashion, even if you have to. It sends a huge message that they're truly part of the development team. You have probably also come up with some others, and I'm certainly open to you sending me an email and telling me about that. In conclusion, here's the takeaways. If QA is your chosen career, the advent of Agile should be much better for you than traditional. You should have a heightened interaction with your peers of software developers. The respect is shown through better communication and collaboration, and basically a required involvement up front. But you do have a different role. You'll be asked to learn scripting and programming languages, subsets, and automation, and be able to provide capabilities where a single button can be pushed and an entire test suite can be automated. Now, in Agile, you have a much better chance at delivering high-quality software on time than traditional. That's my personal opinion, but don't just take my word. Take the QSM Associates' word for it, which studied over 7,500 traditional projects compared to, I think, a handful or 29 Agile projects. And their findings show that, on average, Agile projects are delivered faster to the market, 37% faster. And Agile projects experience a 16% increase in productivity compared to the industry average. And then Agile projects maintain steady defect rates even when the schedule is compressed. And we all know what happens in a traditional world when the schedule gets compressed, the defect rate goes up exponentially. So with that, I'm going to halt here and turn it over to Hemant for any questions and an introduction to Synerzip.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Excellent presentation. We have a number of really good questions, actually. So I'm going to do a quick overview of Synerzip here while all people in the audience, you guys can think about more questions that you want to ask, and then we'll start taking questions. We'll leave some time for questions. So here's a quick introduction to Synerzip in a nutshell. Synerzip is a software product development partner for small to mid-sized technology companies. We help our clients seamlessly extend their engineering team, both dev and QA, and become more scalable in that process. For each client, we put together a dedicated team of high-caliber software professionals and allow them full transparency so it feels like a one team for our client. And while we're doing that, we are able to help our clients reduce the risk of software that is inherent in software development and delivery because of our expertise in software development in general and Agile development in particular. So applying the right balance of how much QA ratios to apply and all those things, as I talked about earlier, that's a big part of how we reduce the risk for our clients. Another thing we do for our clients to reduce the cost, we have a dual shore operation, a team in India and a team on the US side, and with a combination we are able to provide a significant cost advantage to our clients. And the last point, the fifth point for Synerzip in a nutshell is our ability to provide flexibility to our clients, which is ability to take the team that is working for them at Synerzip and convert it into their captive team whenever they feel like it. So that's Synerzip in a nutshell. And the next page, as it refreshes on your screen, it's a bunch of logos on it, just gives a glimpse of Synerzip clients that we have worked with. Not all our clients, but some of the clients that you may relate to some of these companies. These are almost all our small to mid-sized technology companies. With that, let's take a few questions that are still pending in our queue, and I'm sure we won't be able to do justice to all the questions. So, Mike, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. So there are a series of questions related to what you said on QA automation. So the nature of the questions is that if the development, whether it's a UI screen or otherwise, is not baked, does it make sense to do automation within the sprint, or should you wait for a follow-up so the automation lag, so the QA automation lag the development cycle? That's, I think, the spirit of the question that many people
ask. Okay. So if I could read into that, it's very easy to do manually. Is that what the question is?
And then do automation. Yeah. Let the automation lag a sprint till the function, or sprint or two, till the functionality is baked.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I think it's one of those, walk before you run things. If you think you will have time to do the automation in the next sprint, and it's a better fit for the team, then I would say go ahead and do that. Just remember though that every sprint it becomes harder and harder and harder to run all of the test cases manually because you're incrementing every sprint. So yes, maybe the first few sprints if you just want to do manual testing because it's easy to do, and then you apply your time from a development perspective in subsequent sprints to creating automation. Absolutely, that can work. Now, the very next project, you want to challenge yourself to say, okay, automation right out of the gate.
Yeah, great. Another series of questions related to distributed teams these days. So a number of people have these situations where the development is here and the QA is offshore or other way around.
Yeah.
Everything we talked here about co-located teams, which is of course a good idea. Whether they're offshore, whether they're here, dev and QA should be together. I mean, that's the best practice that you recommend.
Yeah.
And we also see. Any guidance on, is it a complete no-no to have, or is it a workable process to have different time zones?
Yeah. Obviously, co-location of the software developers and QA leads to higher collaboration, and you would think higher quality product and easier time meeting the challenging schedules. But the reality of the world is that software teams are distributed nowadays. You may have a small team located here in the U.S. of software developers and QA, and then a large team located in India or China of software developers and QA. I don't really see the model of, okay, our developers are here in the States and our QA team is in India or China. But I do see, developers on both sides of the ocean. Now, when you have that reality, and most of us do, you have to invent ways to make Agile work as collaboratively as possible. And so, you have to put a little bit more effort into it. You might have to ask both teams, and I'm a big fan of sharing the pain, both teams to adjust their work schedules so that there exists at least a 2-hour overlap of both teams. And on a daily basis, that 2 hours is dedicated to collaboration and nothing else. So, you might have a remote pairing session during that 2-hour overlap. Skype is a big tool. You want to have face-to-face conversations with your distributed team using Skype because, when you look in a person's eyes and they glance away when you're asking a question, maybe that's a visual cue that even though they said yes, they don't really believe in their heart that the answer is yes. So with body language being 80% of all communication, you have to augment your typical Agile techniques to do the best you can across oceans with these electronic tools. But I must admit, distributed Agile has been going on for 8 or 9 years now. So there is a good collection of best practices that allow you to do that. Would anybody in their right mind say that it is as good as co-location? No. People would be crazy to make that claim. But you can do some things to help offset that distance, and you just do the best you can within the realm of those best practices.
Excellent. Well, there are a number of really good questions, but we have run into our time box here.
Sorry, folks. Next time.
So here's
or send myself and Hemant an email with your question, and we will take our best stab at a collaborative answer.
Absolutely, absolutely. We'll be happy to answer these questions via email or a follow-up conversation. And also, what one takeaway I have from this number of questions that are here, Mike, is we should do another encore.
Absolutely.
This topic seems
How about a couple of months down the
Absolutely. I think that sounds
You bet.
Well, thank you all very much for attending today's webinar, and thank you, Mike, for covering
You're
this topic for
My
us.
pleasure.
And see you next month in another Agile webinar. In the meantime, let us know if we can answer any of these questions that we were not able to answer in the session today. Have a great rest of the week. Thanks.